Hello, Amanda. Thank you so much for being here. Before we get into it, take me into your week. Where in the world are you right now? What's on your plate? What are you thinking about? So let's start there.
I'm in sunny North London, and I say sunny North London, I think it's like 30 odd degrees here today. First day back after the bank holiday, and it's utter chaos. We have a conference next week. We're supposed to have a report coming out next week. It's London Tech Week the week after, and people are suddenly asking us if we want to do things. And we are also working on quite a major survey. It's a little bit later than it should have been, so bottlenecked and just non-stop today, I'm afraid.
Well, look, thanks very much for making the time to talk to me. So let's kick off with you were speaking at a Delhi conference, which I had the pleasure of seeing online, not in real life. And at the conference, you said that the future may not belong to the biggest models, but to more efficient open source models running on a fraction of compute. And we're betting on exactly the same at kind of Zavmo. We're training our own small language model called Sarawati, especially for learning. I'm really interested to understand where you see small language models going over the next couple of years. And does education feel like one of the places they make more sense, or can you see it in other industries?
It's interesting. I think there's a bunch of different things that I've seen going on around this. So obviously after the AI summit, Savram in India released their small language model. Initially that was closed, and they then distributed it on an open source model. And they've got quite an interesting way of being sovereign with the Indian government, where the Indian government had invested in them, but then has also given them state contracts, allowing them to raise more funding on the back of those state contracts, which is an interesting way to create a sovereign environment. But I'm sure we'll talk about sovereignty. So it was really the first small language model that I thought a lot about because of it coming out of the summit. I think that we will see more and more of these, maybe all the way to the tiny language models, because of compute. And when we look at compute, you probably heard me say in India that one of the things I learned from visiting China is that the open source developers there and the AI developers more generally are obsessed with compute. And the fact that they don't have the same luxury as the US does means that they create much leaner, smaller models that run more efficiently. And I think we will see a focus on that, which will inevitably bring us to the small language models because of a number of things. One being compute availability, one being the environment, because at some point we will start to be concerned not just about the evils of AI or the goods of AI, but also the sustainable impact through data centers and compute. And I think that we'll also see a commercialization and a business model piece kick in probably in the not too distant future, where when we look at how you monetize AI, the existing models won't work. So if we look at something like, well, she says a sweeping statement, the existing models won't work. But from 20 odd years of working in retail and different environments across tech, what I've seen is that something like a subscription model works well, right? But people are signing up to subscriptions with the big guys just now. And then when the prices start to increase, they're not crack addicted enough to it to go with the price increases. So my hunch is that we're going to see the model shift so that the AI we are buying into is smaller, that it will process more and more locally or close to our homes. We'll still need these giant data centers for training, but we'll need fewer of them because we'll increasingly see the compute on the edge in small data centers or on our devices, set-top boxes, mobiles, whatever it's going to be. So I think that takes it down to small language models. I also think we're increasingly seeing sectorial models and sovereign models, and those two push more and more into the small language models, I think, rather than the large ones.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And in terms of the small language models, in terms of performance, what we're imagining with Saraswati, which is our small language model, is that because we're so focused on such a niche area, we just don't need the power of a large language model.
Yeah.
So what we're only interested in outcomes that are to do with a specific thing, in our case, learning delivery. So when I look at it, I'm like, I don't know why you would pay for something that's a 10 when you really only need something, a really good focused 1 or 2.
When you and I were chatting in preparation for this, I said, ask me about the dot-com boom, not just to flag up how old I am and that I was part of it, but also that it's a continuum of experience, right? And it may be that everything we see today happens faster because we are in a faster paced world. But we're in that faster paced world because of the internet. If we didn't have the internet, if we didn't have the dot-com boom that got us here, we wouldn't be able to do a lot of the things we're doing today. And when that happened, I suppose I was really at the coalface in that I worked for an ISP, but I also worked in Europe's biggest electrical retailer, which had created that ISP. So I had the privilege in the early 2000s to see a suite of devices that did not become successful, like tablets, for another 10, 15 years. And there's a bunch of reasons. Most of it was around adoption and the marketplace, and that was about connectivity. And I think that we are seeing a similar process. I know everybody says AI is the biggest thing ever, but I think we're seeing something very, very similar, which is that people have to work out how to use it. They have to build the skills. The products have to become have to have better utility than they currently do, which happens over time. And then you need access and connectivity in the internet and in the world of AI. You need that GPU, compute access, and you need consumers to be warm towards what they're doing and really see that there's a value towards it and a return on investment. And that shift in humans doesn't happen as instantly. You might have a pace of AI innovation, but the pace of human acceptance is slower.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you talk to a lot of governments and CEOs about AI. Um, but specifically, just kind of leaning into that question, right now, what does the person who's sitting behind their desk, what does AI mean for the skills that they need to move towards? So what does, kind of AI powered learning or development or upskilling, what does it look like for them and how are we going to take them on that journey?
I think it's quite difficult. And I see a lot of disparity. So if you talk to people who are not in tech, their engagement with AI currently seems to be entirely different. Their engagement, there's this sort of sense of panic that they have to be using it and trying to bring it into organizations without really understanding what it's going to do for them. And I think that you have that garbage in, garbage out messaging. And that's not just about training. If you try to stick AI into your organization, but your sophistication isn't there to use it well, you're wasting your time and your money. And I think we see that with things like agentic. And I think agentic does something which makes the AI that we know through models and that we will prompt and ask questions of go a step further to act as your agent, to have agency from you, to go and do a task on your behalf. Now, it's something that I worked on when I ran legal teams 20 years ago, but you need a mind map, really. You need an ontology. You need an understanding of the task that you're asking and exactly how to do that task and all the variables that you can have and all the things that can go right and wrong. And those need to be sort of mapped out. And I think when we instruct a person to do something, we might have some of that. You might have put Visio into a call center and mapped it all, but you're not going to have done that for every task in your organization.
Yeah.
And that upfront work is actually a lot of work. And to get the return is quite hard. And I suspect what we'll see that you asked me about skills, I'm not avoiding the question, but I expect what we'll see is a gradual shift for people to learn how to give AI agency, as well as learning how to prompt, which is slightly different from using a search engine. And then, even I can remember the first time we used it to do a design piece. I was like, oh, can we go back and just change 2 designs ago? And it was gone
Yeah.
into the ether. And I had no idea that it didn't do version control in that way and didn't keep things. So it's that kind of learning how to use it. And you're not sensibly going to put something into your critical pathway if you don't have that. And I think the world that I live in is quite niche and small, and it's probably 2 or 3% of the population that engage in tech the way the people around me do. Maybe it's less, but that other 90%, I'm giving a bit of a buffer for people who are sort of in betweeners. But I think 90% of society doesn't know what they're meant to do with it.
Well, I mean, I think, your point also raised something that, I've been in L&D for, the last 25 years. And one of the things that people often, say to me in L&D, well, the problem is I don't actually know what this person does on a daily basis. So in terms of kind of standard operating procedures,
Yeah.
people are incredibly creative in their current roles, right? So somebody will ask them to do something and they will typically say, yes, but, or how about this, right? And
Right.
so standing operating procedures and then mapping that to agentic work is quite problematic, because what ends up happening is, humans can adapt on the fly and they have a memory from the time they've been, you know, in that environment, right? But agents don't. They don't have infinitesimal memory, and they don't have the ability to connect disparate ideas from lots of different
Exactly.
avenues. And so, yeah, I think people, it's, yeah,
And
interesting.
that's part of the learning, right? Because you're looking at large language models or language models that we think have consumed all of the data that's anywhere on the planet. Right? We think it's got everything public, to an agent that will only do exactly what you tell it. We hope you don't want your agent off doing its things of its own choosing. Whether the whole sort of moat book thing is to be believed or not, we don't want it thinking this would be helpful to my instructor. So we want it to only act within the parameters set from a security and safety perspective. And there's a totally different learning there. I've pointed people a few times at the government. I suppose it's a platform that they set up, portal that they set up, which had a lot of training. I've not used it myself, so I don't know how good the content is. But I think actually bringing those training skills into a practical organizational structure will be a big thing. And one
Mm.
of the challenges that I know everybody's having is the overwhelm. So many people trying to sell you something to do with AI, it just becomes completely overwhelming to the average person in a business.
Yeah, the other thing that I think is really interesting is that, your point about people think that, LLMs have absorbed everything there is to know about the internet, but they also think that they've absorbed everything in the internet equally. So everything has got it's democratization of this huge amount
Yeah,
of information. And the reality is that is not true either. There is real bias in these large LLMs. There is real, there's not perfect information out there. So, they're not going to, give you the best, or, yeah,
it's
I find that
interesting.
interesting
There's
as well.
there's two things that you make me think of, and the first is about mediocrity. I don't know if this is true, but somebody suggested to me that what they do effectively is feed you up the average of the content they've
Yeah.
learned. And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be average. So if it gives me a response that's average, it's obviously going to have some work, and that requires my discernment, but it might be a helpful starter point for me still. It's definitely not the end point, in my opinion.
Mm.
And then the other thing, and I've only heard this being discussed once, so I don't know how commonplace it is or well known, but abstention. So when you have hallucination, and then you have, I suppose, bullshit answers where it just gives you an answer because it feels it has to, and it's not hallucinating. It just doesn't want to upset you. So it gives you an answer, right or wrong. And I think I never thought about that before, actually. People pleasing. AI is a bit of a people pleaser.
It's definitely a people pleaser, and also it just keeps going on. So if you say to AI, "Is there anything else? Anything else I should be thinking about? Do you think I've missed anything? Any ways I could improve this document?" It'll just go on and on and until you've forgotten the original the
So
original thing you asked it.
the other term that I've come across this year is abstention, and training AI not to answer, to say, don't have that one.
Yeah.
And I think that actually is a huge missing piece in what we've seen when it
Mm.
comes back to the large language models. But I think generally there is this need for training, but to be trained, you have to understand your end goals.
Yeah.
So you have to have a little bit of knowledge of the AI. What is it that I think it can do for me? Be able to validate that thinking, and then get the skills that you need. And I think we're all trying to run at this so fast that we're a bit at sixes and sevens. If
Yeah.
small children are listening to this, they'll love that. But that's 6, 7. But I think there is this issue or disconnect currently between the desire to use it, how I can be more effective. And oddly, the place that it seems to be working best is when it comes to coding.
Yeah, and I think the reason it works best in coding is because it's finite. So if you think about, large language models and this idea that they're going to solve everything, no, they're not. They're going to be really, really good at one thing. And the great thing about coding is that it's a language. It's got X amount of, things that that language does that is it's good at, but it's very, very different to something. I mean, maths is also a great domain, and anything that is almost closed, I
Yeah.
think, small language models, or, specialized language models can do really good, well at. I think where they are not so good is anything that requires like pivoting and, going back to what you were saying before about how organizations are looking at large language models, they typically seem to be saying, okay, well, let's get the whole elephant. And actually, what they want to be doing is saying, I've got this tiny little thing that we could automate. Does everybody agree it happens exactly the same all the time? Fantastic. That's a good use case for an
Yeah,
agent.
I think that's exactly right. And I think it's things like productivity, and it can be a productivity tool, but it can also be a burden. I don't know if you've ever done this, but I've tried to map all of our organizational processes before, and it's hugely time consuming. And you end up with the Bible. It's a massive, massive document that nobody else wants to read. And then you have to convert it into something visual. And I think that that process is one that we're going to see more and more people doing, and then creating that language or that ontology around it. But that isn't something that's easy to access and do. Even if you've done it before, it's not easy to do.
Mm.
For most organizations, they don't have the resource. So I think there will be people whose jobs it becomes for a period of time to help with that change management and that transition to AI, productivity suites, tools, whatever it is we're going to call it. It's a lot, right?
Yeah, it's a lot.
We look at it very much as technologists, but to come back to the point I made earlier, most of the world is very worried about AI, and they're not welcoming it the way that they welcomed an iPhone or whatever we're talking about. There's been a significant change before.
Yeah.
Even the printing press wasn't very welcome either. So I guess maybe it's a bit more like that.
Yeah, yeah. Let's move on to open source AI because you've said some really interesting things about people fundamentally just misunderstanding what, open source AI is. So, do you think that most people are using the phrase wrongly? And if so, what are they really missing in terms of open source AI?
It's a bit of a battleground, this one. And in some ways, I want to try and avoid getting into the debate of what open source AI as a term means. So, open source is something we know and understand. It's got a definition. That definition's over 30 years old, and millions, if not billions, of people rely on that definition. And that definition's the open source definition, has 10 different points to it, and licenses must comply with it. So, what that means is that when you're sharing software, that software is shared in a way that makes it public, and it's on an approved license that meets the open source definition. When we look at the open source definition, I think there's two key points, which is that anyone can use the code for any purpose. And I call that out because those points are the ones that create friction around somebody being disingenuous and saying that something's open source when it's not. So if we fast forward that into AI, there was an exercise to try and create a sectorial definition, which I think it's fair to say has failed. It's not got adoption. There's something like 20 odd companies signed up to it, that's never going to shape the world. So I go back to the original open source definition used for software, and I want to see a license that is approved in that environment or meets the open source definition. I want to see the AI released on that. And then I think we have to break it down into what is it that's being shared, and is it on an open source license? And the what is it is where we get into the controversy, because we are the biggest bit of the controversy. Because when we disaggregate the AI, there are different components. And, whether you're talking algorithms or whether you're talking agents or whether you're talking code or whether you're talking data. And I think we have to be quite specific. So I think open models is a good way of referring to language models. Um, I think open agents or open agentic technology also helps there. But I think the way open source is used is very confusing. I try to avoid it. I try to talk about AI openness and to be quite embracing of different levels of open. back in 2023, OpenUK actually supported Meta with the Llama launch. Now, yeah, Lear Face, we were the only open source organization that did it. And all the way up to the point of launch, Meta called Llama open innovation.
I mean, I think this is when we were deciding on what open source model we would use. Obviously, the internet is like llama, llama, llama. But actually, as you so rightly say, once you get into the small print, it is just not fit for purpose if you are looking to train your own small language model. And I just wish, we went through a big learning curve, in terms of trying to assess which model was right for us to start
Yeah,
training. And I think it's very, it's not opaque at all. It's
it's
very,
not opaque. And it created an environment where I think the New York Times and The Economist both had on the front page headlines about open washing. And as an open source nerd of, 20 years standing, I never expected to see anything about open source in the public domain in that mainstream press. And the challenge is that anyone can use it for any purpose. And you and I know, but maybe not everybody listening knows, that the Llama community license doesn't meet the original open source definition. It
Mhm.
has an acceptable use policy that restricts how you can use it. And it also requires you to get a commercial license at a certain point in time. So that's based on the number of users you've got, which if you're actually doing something open source would be very difficult to track because you don't take registrations.
Mhm.
So it is not fit for purpose in that way. And also, and interestingly, Llama, like all the models, would be accused by some of having trained on data. Obviously, there's a whole load of people who don't like that. You get into text and data mining, whether that's okay or not. But in the last few weeks, we've seen the Trump administration complaining about China because China is winning on the open source front and claiming that distillation is a breach of copyright. I think it's quite interesting because the actual model training is legal where it is because it is a transient copy that's created. And I think distillation is a very similar argument. So it's quite a slippery slope for those who've already trained their models on public
Absolutely.
data, some of which is copyrighted, to then be complaining about others distilling, and that sort of, for me, goes back to this: anyone can use it for any purpose. And what really matters about that is that it creates a cascading effect. It creates a reliability. And it's one of the keys to why open source has succeeded. You can take and you can pass on without any worry other than laws, right? So of course laws trump it. And if there's a export control or something like that, you have to comply with it. But that aside, on a licensing perspective, that's absolutely critical to success. And I think it's actually one of the reasons Llama hasn't succeeded in the way Meta wanted it to. And I don't think they've ever publicly said that, but the new models are not being open sourced on the same license. They're currently proprietary. There are rumors that they're going to be opened, but I suspect that if they open something up, they won't do it on the Llama license again.
Interesting. So I'm really keen to kind of, I know that you travel a lot. So, I mean, I've been looking at your movements, on social media. I mean, this year you've been to Delhi, Kigali, Beijing. In terms of how those different countries and, all the other travels that you've been doing over the period, does AI look different from different cultural perspectives than it does from the UK,
Yeah,
but also the US? I mean, our
yeah.
feed just filled with what, the tech bros from the US think about AI. But is that really the global view? Or do we just think it's the global view because we get hit in the face with it so much?
I don't even think it's a pan US view. I think that one of the pieces that the open source community are very familiar with is an American tech sector that is primarily on the coasts. And you're only looking at maybe 3 to 5 locations, Boston, New York, Oregon, and down into California. So I suspect that the view that we see is actually very limited within the US, but the funding that's associated with that is so vast
Mm.
in terms of the US economy. We've allowed, I mean, that it's basically a 30-year mini history, right? We've allowed these tech companies to grow in an unprecedented way because we didn't understand what was happening. Therefore, our regulators haven't understood what was happening. I don't believe they would have allowed it had they known. I think now we have this challenge where you go to somewhere like Africa and they'll tell you that they've got a certain level of connectivity. Interestingly, they're very keen on sovereignty in Kenya, and they were telling me that they run a national ISP. The Wi-Fi when I was there was very variable. So if you've got variable Wi-Fi, you're not going to be running AI on it. I was in India, very different again. They have everything on the device. Macron at the summit was interesting because he talked about Mistral and France having its own LLM and France's very, very strong desire for sovereignty. And then he said, but India has made an also correct but different decision, which was a small language one that you and I have been talking about. And that's partly because they have a world of devices that are in their hands. You may not have electricity at home, but you've still got a smartphone. And I think the smartphone is almost universal there, which has its own downside. It is WhatsApp communication is totally overwhelming. But I think that creates a technological difference in every environment in how AI is going to get to people. I think we're seeing a rollout in Africa of data centers that is quite different. I'm hearing lots of people talking to me about very small data centers, some the size of cupboards that can be rolled out fast. So I think that and satellite make a shift for those countries, which may also allow them to leapfrog. When you were talking before about skills, there is definitely concerted activity to train young people in open source in certain countries because they know that building that capacity for the long term is going to be very influential. And then obviously you're looking at a very closed world coming out of the US. I mean, there's things like, I don't know if it's new or news, NOUS, but there's definite open source stuff coming out of the US, as well as people like OpenAI doing their own models. And NVIDIA, of course. But then when you go to China, they've had an 8-year strategy to get to where they are in open source. It didn't just happen overnight. And their last 5-year plan came out last October, end of October 25. And it's now talking about streamlining, so having less competing products and more focus on monetization. Moving to the sort of next steps of the journey. So I think the AI, the fundamental AI isn't different. I think a lot of the shift happens quietly. So if you speak to someone like Peter Steinberger, who created OpenClaw, he did it between jobs and he was playing around with something in that creative freedom that he had. I think a lot of the leaps don't come out of the high pressure environments that we expect them to, and they come from these random things, and that's opened and accessed through open source. And if people didn't have that access, which also goes back to making sure we've got skills, making sure we've got compute to allow those people being creative to access it. Here in the UK, the SovAI creates a fund, the Sovereign AI Fund creates a fund, but also is promoting, I think it's the same access the government have already announced, but lots of access for individuals and startups to compute for innovation.
Right.
But I think that whole infrastructure is a sort of pause point where we have to understand that we've got that in place and we give the right people access. And the right people aren't just the obvious people like the big companies. So it's very different place to place, right?
But just building on that, one of the things that I think is really interesting is like, where is the money? As a ed tech entrepreneur, who's trying to build an AI learning platform, one of the things that I find really interesting is that when you look at AI startups and you look at what people are actually building, a lot of people are just building, wrappers around an existing LLM, which I just can't see is really solving the problem. And then the other thing is that even if you look at the large language models, there's a few of them that are making money, but not everybody's making money. And
Right.
so, that just really confuses me.
Yeah, well, it goes right back to where we started, right? There is a tech sector that for a very long time, your valuation and your paper worth had nothing to do with revenue. And people got hooked on that. And it's only been the last 2 or 3 years where old school, you have to make money to be worth something, came back to the fore. So we've got all of that still kicking in. And I guess that was 24 onwards. So you've got that mind shift change generally. I think there's also a bit of a problem when it comes to talking about return on investment. And it would be nice to see more research on this. We do a lot of reviewing literature that's out there, and there just hasn't been enough showing return on investment. It's not an easy thing to show at the best of times.
Mm,
But I think people are knee-jerk purchasing and then not using.
yeah.
And certainly, I sort of jokingly talk about, of course, I've paid for a subscription at one stage to OpenAI because I wanted to play with it. Of course I have. But I didn't keep doing it. I didn't feel compelled that this was something I needed to have. I think that a lot of people are in similar positions. They're trying to see where the value is. My understanding is that it's productivity tool, and the
Mm,
people that you and I speak to are very cutting edge, are trying to work out the security, the sort of mythos effect, so that they know that they can sell products comfortably in the market and that we will want to get those products. What I'm seeing successful at the moment is the back end of it, the dev tools and that focus we talked about where, AI is definitely good for software development. It may not be good for copywriting software development, but it's definitely good for software development as a tool.
mm.
Is it as good for society as a whole yet? Probably not.
I mean, one of the areas that we're exploring really hard with Zavmo is conversational learning. So
Right.
in learning, what we know is that the more personalized you can get the learning conversation. So if you've got a one-on-one tutor, it obviously works a lot better than if you're in a classroom and there's 30 other people. And so one of the things that's very appealing about AI is the fact that if you lock down the zone of acceptable conversation, you can then begin to get a much better, highly personalized conversation. And I think that kind of mode of interface is particularly interesting for learning, not necessarily the ability to draw on a huge, unregulated, rather messy corpus of
Yeah.
information, but how you can get the LLM to talk and discuss and benchmark to best in class learning pedagogy. So, you know, how you can get the learners to move up Bloom's taxonomy, how you can get them to engage with topics in a way that works uniquely for their particular brain. So, slightly different kind of focus, I think, on the.
Yeah, and that kind of individual thing is interesting. Back in February, I was at MWC in Barcelona, and one of the things that I heard multiple times was that we could expect to see everybody having a personal assistant that was AI in the next 6 to 12 months. So I guess it's there for the taking if that's what you want. And then the next stage that they were really talking about was embodiment. And I was tempted for a very brief time on the sunny weekend to look at the internet. What I noticed on LinkedIn was quite an interesting post with somebody talking about robots and how we love when a robot falls over. As soon as it falls over,
Yeah,
yeah, we love it.
we love it.
Yeah, which is pretty mean actually. But we then post these videos of this poor sad robot falling over, and the responses to that were interesting, partly because we're seeing agentic embodied into robotics, and that's happening at pace. And I think that will show us that personal assistant becoming a 3D personal assistant, actually doing physical things and taking it away from manufacture into our homes. Slightly worryingly, in Barcelona, they had robots boxing, and that to me was going towards the military end and a little bit frightening. And I
Mm,
think that actually will cause quite a lot of pushback in society when that kind of stuff becomes more mainstream.
mm.
Do you think that robots, in the same ways we're seeing drones used in warfare at the moment, wars are being fought by drones more than people, which may actually be a good thing if the consequences weren't for people. I think there's a lot to take on board there.
Mm.
But I also think in our day-to-day existences, it's going to be more than a Hoover that's running around, your living room that bounces off skirting boards. I think we are going to see that embodied AI become a bigger thing quite quickly.
And do you think that, we anthropomorphize AI? Do you think that we.
I have a cat, so I'm the wrong person to ask. I have a talking cat. We answer more. Yes, we do. And it's also another challenge that I think we're going to have. It's what does that mean? There's so much on the news just now about children and their interaction with social media. When we look at our relationships with AI, I'm being told that we're going to have to start to treat it like a colleague. Now, does that mean you say please and thank you? Does it mean that you behave as if this is a member of the team?
Mm.
And that's the messaging that I'm seeing, that we should be doing that. We will be doing that. Then I think, what does that mean? Does it have the same rights? Where do we get to with, things like copyright? It shifts everything.
Yeah, that is very interesting. Kind of a niche rabbit
Yes.
hole to walk down.
Well, these are big things, but when we were talking before, we were talking about the other technological advancements in history, like the iPhone and smartphones. I mean, those were massive. I don't know whether these big challenges make it a bigger thing for us to experience than what we've experienced before. I was talking to a friend and somebody asked her what did you do before you had email? We can both remember starting work without email. And
Mm.
she looked at them and said, my job, because you now spend your whole time interacting via chat and email with people. It's hard to actually get things done. That's quite a big shift. I don't know whether it will be a bigger shift or not.
I mean, one of the things that I liken this AI shift to is more the printing press. So the unleashing of intelligence for many, many people. Because I kind of think like before the printing press, the way, we learn about religion, there really wasn't a broader, much of an education outside, what we heard in the churches. And then suddenly the arrival of printing press where we could all, create stories and we could all, have a wider audience was something that just wasn't available. And I think that kind of crisis about goodness gracious, the whole foundations of society is changing because more people have a voice, more people have a way of doing things. And that change
Yeah.
seems more akin than, the iPhone.
Mhm.
Because it seems more, high impact.
Yeah. I don't agree with you.
Great.
I sort of agree with you. And I sort of agree with you in that I heard something from the Hay Festival over the weekend where apparently in the Victorian era, they didn't like women reading novels, and they didn't like women reading novels because it caused hysteria. And you can imagine. But it
Mm.
gets back to that bias piece we've already hit on, right? And this cultural shift. Then if you think about the printing press unleashing, unleashed to those who could get their hands on books and print, but that was a very small group. And what we've seen with, first of all, the World Wide Web is an accessibility at a scale that is unprecedented. And I don't think the printing press was as big a shift or more of a shift anyway than the internet has been,
Yeah.
because of the depth of its reach,
Mm.
the sort of all-consuming nature of it. I think it has societally shifted us at a scale, and it shrunk the world, which has allowed all of this sort of false information, fake news, whatever, lack of certainty in who we're speaking to. All of these different issues have come from that. But that would never have been as successful or as pervasive without, whether it's a smartphone or just devices. I think it is the smartphone. And if you think back to 2008 through maybe 12, you had 2 rounds of apps that didn't work. And it was only when the apps actually started to influence your living
Mm.
really made a difference. But everything I do, whether it's my banking, my laundry, whatever it is, I need my phone to do it. I can't do it without my phone.
No, I mean, yeah, I'm the
Money.
same. I mean, you're completely lost without your phone. Yeah.
So I don't think that
So,
would be a
just ask.
shift.
I want to
Sorry.
ask you a little bit about the work that you do at Open UK. So, the person responsible for security in big companies, they often say, open source is a risk, and you kind of hear that all the time. But what is your view from a kind of Open UK
Yeah.
point of view? What are you advocating for?
Yeah. I totally agree with them. Open source is a risk, as is closed. The opposite of open source is sort of proprietary software, and proprietary software is a risk, and proprietary software is probably almost an equal risk on the open source front, because over 90% of it requires open source to run today. So that dependency level is so great that it really isn't that different from open source. But you also have an added layer of risk with either open or proprietary that is different, right? You've got the closed black box approach of the proprietary versus the open washing our dirty linen in public and community response from open source. We're actually about to publish a report on the next, I was about to give you a date. We're actually about to publish a report in the next 10 days on cybersecurity. And on the 10th of June in the UK, our politicians are going to be debating the cyber regulations, which will come down the line for the UK, a bit like the EU Cyber Resilience Act in some ways. So it's very, very topical. And of course, what we do at OpenUK, we do sort of three things. We are an industry organization bringing together the open source ecosystem. We recognize that most of us work internationally, so we don't focus on local companies, we focus on local people who are part of that community, and we bring them together. We run a recognition program with awards and honors, and we do case studies and things. We then have a separate function where we do policy work, and that policy work includes research and reporting, as well as interacting with organizations and politicians to try to influence the policies in the UK. And we do a lot of research and more and more as time goes by, because there's a lack of that. And we set up a sister organization, OpenHQ, to sort of internationalize that research and reporting and policy work. And we've been working in Africa this year and India, and we're also working in China, as well as doing the UK stuff we've always done. And then we do a bit of skills development, which I should probably talk to you more about offline.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to see if we've got any opportunities to work together. So within Open UK, we're encouraging an open first approach to the public sector, to anything that's funded by the UK public sector. We have a suite of recommendations we made via UKRI a year ago, and those include building a national foundation. And I think one of the challenges that we see across AI that we've not talked about as much today as I expected is sovereignty. And we don't recommend a foundation purely because of sovereignty. We recommend it because it's the way to naturally evolve an open source ecosystem. It's one of the first things China did in building theirs, but actually it has a very sovereign aspect or flavor to it as well. Because if you want to have influence, holding the intellectual property and having the structures and the projects coming from your country is a big thing. And at the moment, we see that in the US and China. It's shifted slightly so that we have some out of Europe, but the UK really doesn't have that in place. And I
And
think
I think it is one of the things that we've come across with Zavmo. So with Zavmo, what we project is getting large data sets in and around skills and education systems from different countries, and looking at the skills of different countries so that, you can define what good looks like. So we've ingested all of Ofqual, we've ingested all of NOS, we've ingested all of the Australian system, we've ingested all of Germany's system. So we know, what the education systems of these countries look like. And then, of course, we can sell that content or bits of that content to anywhere in the world that wants to upskill in an area that they maybe do not have a formalized learning specifications for, right? And one of the things that we've hit upon really early is that education reflects local culture.
yeah,
And so this idea of sovereignty is wrapped up in so many different things, including the delivery of engaging content. So, for example, we're working on a project in Armenia. They have a specific culture, and we can't engage learners
yeah,
if we don't ingest large amounts of local information. So this is information on their legal system. This is information on their educational system. This is information on their, literary, world. It's one of those things that if you are actually going to have a relationship with an audience, it is absolutely vital that you have that cultural and sovereign.
Yeah, I think the best way I've heard that explained was at GTC, and Jensen Hung talked about it, and he talked about intelligence. He's a very smart salesman and he's selling people chips, right? But he's saying, I'm selling you American chips for you to build your sovereign environment on.
Mm.
Way he's doing it is talking about intelligence. And by that, he doesn't just mean your security services, which is what many of us think about. He means also your language and your culture. So language culture in a secure way, I think is really what I think he hit the nail on the head. Is really what we mean in most cases. And I think one of the dangers of sovereignty as a concept is that people don't understand the stack and the different layers of the stack, but they also don't understand the sort of nuance between ensuring we're not dependent and that we have local enterprises being built that are also in the game versus building the technology from the ground up. And a lot of people's approach, initially at least, I thought was very foolish because I come from open source and they wanted to build it from the ground up, and you just can't do it. I
No,
don't think we
it's a waste of
understand.
time.
Right, and everything today is about recycling and reusing. Is that open source culture? Because it's too vast to create from and expensive to create from scratch. So you want to have access to the underlying technology, and if you open it up, you have that.
Mm.
Want new innovators, and you want more enterprises locally. If you open it up, you have that. You want to localize it, well, you can definitely do that if it's open. So I think it becomes a no-brainer. That the question then becomes, how do we manage this economically when, as you've talked about, a few big companies control and have the wherewithal to control that ecosystem? And that's your challenge.
And I think that's where organizations, like yours comes into play to say, hey, look, you know, you may be being sold a mirage here. Like you can start off with, your own AI on your own computer, right? So, your own small language model and you can, start training it. The barriers to entry are not,
No.
as it seems. And I think that's, one of the messages that's obviously core to what you're saying. The other thing that I think is interesting is this idea of language. So because most of the very large LLMs are all trained on a English corpus of that is also a real problem. For example, when we are using, a small language model and training that, ultimately the problem that we have is that we have to look at the content in English, right? American English or whatever it might be, and then translate it into Armenian or whatever. And that is not as good as having
No.
a soft model. So yeah, there's lots and lots. So look, just finally, I've taken up so much of your time. Just final question. What is something about AI that surprised you in the last 12 months? Something that turned out slightly differently than you expected?
Nothing. I don't know. Something that's turned out, and this is the question I wasn't sure about when I looked at questions beforehand. I'm not sure that there is anything that I'm really surprised by. I think the thing that surprises me most is how slow we are at joining up well and collectively managing the response, because there's so many people trying to do the right thing and so much replication and so much waste.
Yeah.
I think that we are gradually starting to see the UN and others trying to pull people together. Whether the UN's the right group remains to be seen. But I think there's this real challenge of a coordinated, sensible response to the future. And it doesn't seem that we are getting that from our politicians.
Do you think that that's similar to how we responded to the internet? So do you think there's any difference? Is this just the way that we react
Yeah.
to massive technological change, or are we doing something different this time around?
I think it partly is and it partly isn't. And the isn't is because of the past experience. So I would say 30 years ago, when we started doing legislation for the dot-com boom, it was for retail. And that was what was happening. The World Wide Web was really a sales functionality.
Mm,
The only people really making money were the porn sites, to be honest. And that
July,
should have been
right.
an indication of things to come. Um, the uh the legislation we made was good and fit for purpose for the time, but it didn't envisage the way things went, and it couldn't have because none of us had a crystal ball. But what we should have had was many more breakpoints, and we should have been doing things based on principles at a higher level rather than the granularity. and then working out where that was going to be in the breakpoints. It's a bit like the difference between old school contracting with a waterfall contract with a very detailed specification that you tie something down to, and the sort of agile world where it's more about the governance and knowing when to stop and check if this is working or not working and to reverse or change. And I think we have to see more of a shift in how we regulate to that because of the pace of technology. Partly we are incapacitated because of the internet regulation, because that internet regulation not being changed for so long has made it such a big deal to get the Online Safety Act and other legislation through. We're trying to deal with a world where the digital environment really is everything. That digital twin is a good way to think of it. But the world is either twinned or actually dominated by the digital now and not the analog. And then I think, or the real world. So all of that, and the fact that we have these few powerful companies which have come out of the last 30 years of technology, and I don't think anybody would choose to have that happen again, all influence today, as well as us being at this early stage the same way as we were then and not being sure what we should be regulating. You know, if they'd made regulation a year ago, it would have been very focused on language model. And that would have been wrong because the agentic piece and identity, how we're going to support that. And it's just, if you add those two together, it's difficult. It has to be principles based. And I would definitely encourage people to look at standards and de facto standards that come with openness, things like MCP, as being more of a route to the default regulation that you need, because those are what the people who build this stuff are going to default to.
Right.
And that, you know, regulation as code type mentality, is regulation as AI, is definitely the way to go forward, in my view.
Fantastic. What a great place to end. Really tangible, good advice for us in the trenches, you know, basically trying to build applications on the top of this. Amanda, it's been an absolute pleasure to talk to you. Thank you very, very much for your time. And hopefully we will be able to invite you on the podcast again.
Thank you very much for having me along. It's been a great chat.